At my son's wedding, my sister lifted her glass toward the man who ran her firm, smiled the way she smiles when she wants something, and introduced me as the unemployed one who lives off the family. A fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth 2 seats down. I laughed. I had practiced laughing. Then the silver-haired man beside her set his glass down on the linen, slow and careful, and I watched my sister's smile hold a half-second too long, the way a held note starts to crack right before it breaks. What none of them knew yet was that the man she'd just tried to impress had spent 20 years building his firm on top of work I did before any of them ever thought to ask who I used to be. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where we sit with the quiet women nobody counts, right up until the room finds out exactly who it was talking to. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because this one turns more than once. My name is Renee Calloway. I am 49 years old. For most of that wedding, I stood near the edge of the reception tent with a glass of wine going warm in my hand. I have gotten good at edges. 6 years ago, I would not have known where the edge of a room even was, because I was always somewhere near its center, usually the one other engineers waited on before a design review started, usually the person a contractor called first when a load calculation didn't sit right in his gut. I built structural systems for buildings that are still standing in 3 states. I published, early in my career, a load distribution method that quietly worked its way into how a lot of firms design mid-rise buildings now, uncredited in most rooms, the way good ideas eventually stop needing an author attached to them at all. Self-made, people used to call me, back when anyone bothered to call me anything. Now I was the woman near the coat check, watching my son Ethan laugh with his new wife under string lights, and I felt the strange, settled peace of a person who has already survived the thing she was most afraid of losing. Ethan has my husband's laugh exactly, the specific rhythm of it, 3 short breaths and then the real sound. Nobody at that reception knew that. Nobody there had sat beside a hospital bed with me for 5 years, or understood the quiet ledger of everything those 5 years had emptied out of my professional life, without me ever once regretting a single day of it. To most of the people in that tent, I was Deb's older sister, the one without a job, the one you were kind to the way you're kind to someone who's had some bad luck. I let them think it. I had learned that being underestimated is its own kind of privacy. But underestimation is a loan, not a gift, and eventually somebody always comes to collect. The call that started all of it came almost 6 years before that wedding, on an ordinary Wednesday, while I was standing in a conference room on the 14th floor of my firm's building, going over final drawings for a project I'd led for 2 years. My phone lit up with my husband Tom's name, which was unusual, since he almost never called during the workday. I stepped into the hallway half distracted, and he told me the doctors had found something on the scan, something with a name I didn't understand yet and would come to know far too well over the following years. I did the only math that actually mattered to me, standing in that hallway with the city spread out below the window like something I no longer had time to admire. I could keep climbing, or I could keep the time. I didn't agonize over it the way people expect you to when they hear this part of the story. I went back into that conference room, told my managing partner I was stepping back from the promotion track we'd been discussing for months, and I watched 20 years of careful, deliberate momentum rearrange itself into something else entirely, right there in front of a half-finished set of drawings. My sister Deb was 3 years into her own career at a smaller architecture firm at the time, still mid-level, still climbing carefully, terrified in the specific way ambitious people are terrified of losing ground they haven't fully secured yet. When our family, in the loose, chaotic way families do these things, had a version of a conversation about who might need to step back to help manage things at home while Tom went through treatment, Deb said, almost too quickly, that she couldn't just throw away everything she'd built. She said it fast, like she'd rehearsed the sentence in her head before the question even fully landed, needing us to hear the certainty before we heard the refusal underneath it. I understood her completely, in a way that still surprises me looking back. I have thrown away things I built. I know the specific weight of that particular decision. Deb was not a villain in that conversation. She was a woman who'd climbed a difficult ladder in bad weather, and could not yet imagine loosening her grip on a single rung of it. So I said I would step back instead. I said it the way you volunteer for the thing nobody else in the room will touch, half pride, half love, not yet knowing that the world keeps two very different ledgers, one for the people who stay and one for the people who leave. I didn't resent her for it at the time, and I want to be honest about that, because the resentment that came later didn't actually come from the caregiving itself. It came from what Deb eventually decided that caregiving meant about me. 5 years is a long time when you're measuring it in medication schedules and follow-up scans. I learned the specific, technical language of oncology the same fluent, involuntary way I'd once learned the language of structural code, against my will and completely thoroughly. I sold the house Tom and I had bought early in our marriage, and moved into something smaller, so the money would stretch further. I drove him to appointments before sunrise and learned which nurses handled the worst days gently, and which ones were simply fast and efficient, and how much either quality could matter on a given morning. My license stayed technically active for the first couple of years, quietly renewed out of habit more than intention, and then, somewhere in year 3, I let it lapse, because keeping it current required continuing education hours I genuinely did not have room for in a life built entirely around appointment schedules and small mercies. Some nights, near the end, Tom would surface out of the fog of medication with startling clarity, and on one of those nights, he took my hand and told me something I have carried since like a stone in my pocket. He said the world would measure me by whatever room I happened to be standing in when it looked, and told me, plainly, not to make the mistake of measuring myself the same way. I told him he was being dramatic. He reminded me he was dying and had earned the right to be dramatic if he wanted to. We both laughed, a real laugh, not the careful kind. That was one of the last good weeks. There's a specific mercy in not knowing, at the time, which week is the last good one, until it's already well behind you. Tom died in early spring, a little over a year before that wedding, and something curious happened in the months that followed. People began talking about me in the past tense at family gatherings. Not about Tom. About me. An aunt patted my arm at a holiday dinner and said something about what a shame it was, how I used to be so impressive, as though the word used to had simply attached itself to me permanently along with everything else. Deb, meanwhile, had spent that year steadily climbing at a growing architecture firm, and somewhere in the retelling of our family's last several years, she had become, without ever explicitly claiming it, the daughter who'd held everything together from a distance while I quietly fell apart up close. She told a cousin warmly, at that same holiday dinner, that she worried about me, that she hoped I could find my footing again soon, as though I had simply wandered off some path rather than walked another person all the way to the end of his. That is the part nobody warns you about, going through something like that. You give up the visible parts of your life to do the invisible work, and then the people who kept their visible lives get to narrate, afterward, what your invisible years were actually worth. A year passed. I did the specific, exhausting paperwork that follows a death, which is its own strange second job, and I slowly, carefully started sleeping again. Then Ethan called with the first genuinely good news I'd had in a long time. He was getting married, to a steady, kind woman named Claire, and when he asked if I'd be there, my whole chest ached with something that wasn't grief for once. Near the end of that call, though, my son got quiet, and then he asked me gently not to engage with whatever Deb said at the wedding about my situation, framing it as just one day he didn't want to spend managing a scene. He was 26 and afraid of exactly the wrong thing at his own wedding, and I could hear that he loved me and was faintly ashamed of the request in the same breath. I told him of course, honey, of course, and I meant it completely. It cost me something I didn't have a name for yet, because in that one small, careful sentence. My own son had quietly told me which sister was considered the problem to be managed. Not the one who did the mocking. The one who might mind being mocked. I asked him, gently, one more thing before we hung up, where exactly Deb's firm was these days, since I'd lost track of the specific name over the last few years. He told me, easily, like it meant nothing at all, and the name landed somewhere old and familiar in me, a firm I'd competed against decades earlier, back when I was still active in the field. I told him that was a good firm, and I meant it, and I didn't tell him what else that name meant to me, because I wasn't sure yet myself. The rehearsal dinner was 2 nights before the wedding, held in a private room at a restaurant where the waiters refolded your napkin the moment you stepped away from the table. Claire's family had the quiet, understated kind of money that doesn't announce itself, and I wore the one good dress I'd kept from my old professional life and felt, honestly, a little like a museum piece of myself standing in that room. Deb arrived like she'd booked the space herself, wearing a new watch and an even newer confidence, and within 10 minutes she was holding court near the window, telling stories that all seemed to end in one way or another, with her being right about something. I found a chair near the edge of the room, which by then felt less like exile and more like a good vantage point. From the edge, you see everything. You see exactly who a person is when they believe the people who matter are watching. Deb kept glancing toward the door all evening, waiting for someone. That someone didn't arrive until the wedding reception itself, but he came up constantly in her conversation that night regardless. My CEO, she kept saying, David is remarkably demanding, incredibly selective, and she told a long story about a presentation she'd once redone overnight after he'd rejected an earlier draft, how she'd won him over eventually through sheer persistence. She said his name, David Whitfield, the way some people say the name of someone they are hoping will finally, properly notice them. She dropped it in front of Claire's father, who nodded politely, and in front of my son, who beamed with quiet pride that his aunt worked so closely with someone that important. She dropped it, too, while glancing at me, as if to make sure I understood the precise distance between a woman who reported to David Whitfield and a woman who reported to no one at all. The name meant almost nothing to me at the time. I'd left active practice before firms like hers had fully absorbed the design methods I'd once worked on, and I had never personally met the man. But Deb didn't know that either. She only knew that I used to be somebody, in some vague, unspecified way the family had stopped examining closely, and now apparently wasn't. She wanted the somebody she remembered in me to witness exactly how far she'd climbed since. She had no idea she was about to get a much closer audience than she'd bargained for. It was Claire's mother who asked me, kindly, over the salad course, what I did for work. A simple, human question. I opened my mouth to answer honestly, to say I'd stepped back from structural engineering years earlier to care for my husband and was only now starting to think seriously about what came next, which was the truth and not a shameful one. Deb answered before I got the first word out. She laughed, a light little laugh, and said Mel's, sorry, Renee's between things right now, has been for a while, bless her. She said it fondly, which was the real skill of it, wrapping the whole comment in enough warmth that anyone who flinched would end up looking unkind for flinching instead of her looking unkind for saying it. Claire's mother smiled uncertainly and moved the conversation along, and I sat there, introduced in front of my son's new family as a woman defined entirely by absence, as if the 5 years I'd spent holding my husband's hand through chemotherapy and late-stage decline was simply a gap in a timeline rather than the fullest, most demanding work I have ever done in my life. I stepped outside after the entry for air, and Claire followed me. She stood beside me in the cool evening and didn't rush to fill the silence right away, which told me a great deal about her before she said a single word. Then she asked, quietly, whether it was true that I'd taken care of Tom for a long time, and whether that had been as hard as it sounded. That was the whole thing, really. She asked me about the actual life I'd lived instead of the empty space everyone else preferred to talk around. I told her a little, the early mornings, the specific nurses, the last good week. She listened like it was worth listening to, and at one point said quietly that it wasn't nothing, that it sounded like it had actually been everything. It is a strange thing, having your own son's new wife be the first person in a year to hand you back a piece of yourself you didn't realize you'd been missing. The moment I keep returning to from that rehearsal dinner happened over dessert, and it happened with a small stack of paper. Claire's father mentioned, almost in passing, that he might need architectural consulting down the line for an expansion at his company, nothing firm yet, just thinking aloud. Deb moved like a shark that has just felt the water change temperature. She reached into her bag and produced her business cards, her firm's name embossed in deep blue, her own name and title beneath it in clean, confident type, and found them across the tablecloth like a winning hand before sliding a few toward Claire's father with a practiced smile. Then she turned to me, let the pause stretch just long enough for the whole table to feel its weight, and asked, lightly, whether I had anything to give them too, anything at all. The table understood immediately the question wasn't really about business cards. It was about whether I still counted as anyone in particular. I didn't have one. My old cards had gone into a drawer years earlier along with the rest of that life, and I hadn't printed new ones, because I genuinely didn't yet know what they should say. I smiled and told her I was fresh out. She smiled back, satisfied, and the dessert plates arrived, and the moment passed for everyone else at that table but me. I carried those fanned blue cards in my mind the entire drive home that night. Back in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done in a long while. I took down an old box from the top shelf of my closet, not documents, nothing I could have waved at anyone as proof of anything, just a single photograph of Tom and me at an industry conference maybe 18 years earlier, both of us laughing at something just outside the frame, me in a lanyard and blazer, him having flown in specifically to watch me give a keynote he didn't understand a single technical word of, the way he liked to do sometimes, just to sit in the back and beam. I sat on the floor with that photograph and asked myself the question I'd been quietly outrunning for a year. If I'm not producing anything anyone can measure, am I still anything at all? It's an ugly question to catch yourself asking honestly, because it meant some part of me had started believing Deb's version of the arithmetic, the world's version, the specific math, that says a woman without a current title is a woman without current worth. I didn't cry over it. I just sat with the photograph and let the question be honest, because you can't repair a thing you refuse to name clearly first. Tom's voice came back to me from that last good week. Don't make the mistake of measuring yourself the same way. I put the photograph in my purse before I left for the wedding the next morning. I couldn't fully explain why. I just wanted him there with me. The morning of the wedding, Ethan needed help with his tie, the way he always has since he was small. He came to find me in the little room off the Vineyard Chapel, with the ends of it hanging loose, and that same helpless look he's had since he was 6 years old. I stepped in and tied it the way my own father once taught me, my hands steady even though his weren't, and I smoothed his collar and looked at my son in his suit and had to breathe carefully for a second. He met my eyes in the mirror and his face crumpled slightly. He apologized again for what he'd asked me on the phone about not engaging with Deb, said he knew it wasn't fair of him to ask. I told him it was fine, that I wasn't going to be a single ounce of trouble that day, that I meant it as a gift and not a sacrifice. He hugged me hard, the way he used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. What I didn't know yet was that keeping that peace wasn't going to be entirely up to me. Someone else was about to reach for the pin holding the whole thing together. The ceremony itself was short and genuinely beautiful, which is exactly how a ceremony should be. Then came the reception under open-sided tents strung with lights against the dusk, grapevines climbing the support posts. I'd been seated well back, at a table with an elderly great-aunt and 2 of Claire's college friends, which I understood completely. The front tables were reserved for the people the whole evening was quietly performing for. From my seat near the back, I watched Deb work the room, orbiting one man in particular all evening, an older man with silver hair, calm in the specific, unhurried way genuinely powerful people tend to be calm, taking up no more space than he needed to. Deb refreshed his drink twice. She laughed a half-second too long at whatever he said. I recognized the choreography instantly, not because I knew him, but because I had once been the person a room quietly arranged itself around, and I understood exactly what it looks like when someone badly wants to be arranged around in turn. The founder's name, David Whitfield, had come up constantly the night before, but I still didn't recognize him personally until Deb, glancing across the tent and finding me at my small back table, began walking my way with him in tow. I understood what was coming the same way you understand weather rolling in. Deb wanted to use me as scenery, a small, generous gesture in front of her boss. Look how gracious I am with my poor, unemployed sister. Some people build themselves up honestly. Deb had only ever learned to build herself up by standing on someone slightly lower, and tonight, in front of the most important man in her professional life, the someone was me. She arrived at my table glowing, gestured toward me with an open hand the way a hostess presents something slightly curious, and turned to David Whitfield to make her introduction. "This is my sister," she said, bright as a bell. "Renee, the unemployed one, lives off the family, bless her, been between things for years now." She said it fondly, smiling, as if fondness were the same thing as kindness. I did the thing I had trained myself to do over the past year of being narrated by people who were never actually in the room with me. I laughed, gently, not bitterly. And then I looked at this David, and said the truest, quietest thing I had. "She's right," I said. "I don't have a title anymore." I meant it, in that first second, as surrender. I meant, you win, Deb. I'm done fighting the story. But some sentences turn in your mouth as you're saying them, because the moment those words left me, they stopped feeling like an apology, as if a title had ever been the actual thing that made me who I was. Across the little table, David Whitfield went very still, and set his drink down on the linen slowly, deliberately, and looked at me the way no one had looked at me in a long time, like I was a person worth actually focusing on. "I'm sorry," he said, to me, ignoring Deb entirely. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. What did you say your name was?" I told him, Renee. Deb jumped in quickly to fill the space, the way she always does. "Calloway," she added. "She's a Calloway, like me, obviously." She laughed again, trying to steer the conversation back onto rails she controlled. David's eyes never left my face. "Renee Calloway," he repeated slowly, and I watched something surface behind his eyes, some old file being pulled off a deep shelf. Not the Renee Calloway, who published the load distribution method back in the 90s. The great-aunt beside me looked confused. Deb's smile developed a hairline crack, because those were not words she had ever expected to hear attached to the sister she'd spent years quietly shrinking. I said, carefully, that I had developed an early version of it, yes, a long time ago. David exhaled a short, surprised breath, almost a laugh, and shook his head slowly. "A long time ago," he repeated. "My entire structural division still runs on your long time ago." The table had gone completely quiet by then. He told it simply, which somehow made it land harder for Deb. He explained that his firm had built its core design methodology around my published framework years before he'd even become CEO, that it was, in his own words, the backbone of how they engineered every mid-rise project on their books, and that when he'd taken over leadership, one of the first things he'd wanted to do was track down the original author. Every recruiting cycle for years, his team had quietly tried to find me, assuming I'd gone to a competitor, or been buried somewhere under an airtight non-compete. He said he couldn't understand how someone that good simply vanished from the field. I told him, evenly, that my husband got sick, that I stepped back to take care of him, and that he'd died a little over a year earlier. The words landed in that quiet tent with a weight even Deb couldn't talk over. David Whitfield looked at me for a long moment and then asked, gently, where exactly I'd been all that time his team had been searching. I told him, at a hospital, then at a funeral, then figuring out what came next. He nodded slowly, something shifting in his face from professional curiosity into something closer to real respect, and beside him, my sister had gone a specific shade of grey, the shade that comes when a story you've told for years collapses in a single sentence in front of the exact person you most needed it to hold up for. Deb had a choice in that moment, and I want to be fair to her, because there was a version of this where she recovered with some grace. She could have said she was proud of me, that she hadn't fully understood what I'd stepped away from. Instead, she let out a nervous laugh and said something about how that was all ages ago, that I wasn't really in the field anymore, that things move on. She said it reflexively, the way you swat at something without thinking, except she said it to her own CEO, about the woman he had just called the backbone of his firm, having just introduced that same woman as an unemployed burden at her own son's wedding. David turned his head slowly and looked at my sister properly, the way you reread a document and finally catch what you missed the first time. The warmth left his face, not replaced by anger exactly, but by something colder and more final. He set down the drink she'd spent all evening refreshing, and the whole tent seemed to hold its breath. Deb, he said quietly, quiet enough that people leaned in without meaning to. I've heard the way you talk about people at the office. I told myself it was just sharp elbows, ambition. I gave you room for it. He paused. But I just watched you introduce your own sister, a woman our entire firm owes a debt to, as an unemployed failure, at her son's wedding, specifically to impress me. That tells me everything I needed to know and didn't want to. Deb started to say his name, started to say please, and he raised one hand, not unkindly, just finally. This isn't the place, and I won't make it one, he said. But HR will be in touch Monday morning, and I think you already know why. I did not feel the rush of vindication I might have expected, watching my sister's composure come apart in front of Claire's family and my own son. What moved through me instead was something heavier and stranger, because a single quiet sentence had just unmade a woman who genuinely believed a title made her untouchable, and watching it happen, I realized I didn't actually want her unmade. I wanted something else, and I hadn't found the words for it yet. Ethan found the edge of the commotion, wide-eyed, trying to understand how his wedding had turned into this in the span of 5 minutes. Claire reached me first, standing beside my chair with one hand light on my shoulder, a young woman deliberately planting herself next to the family member everyone else had spent years quietly treating as furniture. Deb sat down heavily in the nearest chair, as if her legs had simply given out, and for a second, she wasn't performing anything at all. She looked at me across the wreckage of her own making and said, almost to herself, "You were always the one they remembered." It came out of her like something held underwater for decades, and in that single sentence, I finally understood what she'd meant, years earlier, on that phone call about who would step back to help our parents. She hadn't refused out of heartlessness. She'd refused because she was terrified that if she stepped out of whatever lit room she currently stood in, even briefly, the world would simply forget she existed at all, the way she believed it had always defaulted to noticing me instead. I stood up. I think everyone expected some kind of final line directed at Deb, some closing statement on the account she'd kept against me for years. I didn't give one. I walked instead toward David Whitfield, and asked if I could have a quiet word, and we stepped a little apart from the table, near a post wrapped in grapevine and string lights. That was remarkable, he started to say. What you built, and I owe you. I stopped him gently. Mr. Whitfield, I said, I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange. He waited. Don't fire my sister because of me, I said. He tilted his head slightly. If she's crossed a real line your firm draws, that's your business, and you should do whatever your business requires. But I need to know it isn't a gift to me. I've spent the past year being defined by other people's version of my worth, and I'm not going to start whatever comes next by having a woman destroyed on my behalf. That's not a win I want to own. He studied me for a long moment, and I realized, saying it, that I wasn't only talking about Deb anymore. I was drawing a line about the entire way I intended to let the world hand me things from now on, whether insult or reward, and I meant to be the one holding the pen either way. He was quiet, then he smiled, a real one. You're exactly the person my team spent years looking for, he said, and now I understand exactly why we couldn't find you. People like you don't leave a trail behind. You leave a legacy and simply walk off. Then he became businesslike and made me an offer, a real one, not a courtesy. A senior consulting role at his firm, effectively at the top, a serious salary attached to it, and a promise that he'd personally see to it the industry knew Renee Calloway was back, that the record would be corrected publicly, in a single announcement. Everything the last year had quietly taken from me, restored in an afternoon. He reached into his jacket and set one of his own business cards on the small cocktail table between us. Heavy stock, his name and title in clean type. Right there for me to take. I want to tell you I didn't consider it. That would be a lie, and this story has had enough of those already. I considered it seriously. Everything in me that had gone hungry for status over the past year leaned toward that card. Take it, some old, familiar part of me said. Take the title, take the salary, take the public correction, walk back into the field vindicated, let Deb watch it happen from wherever she landed next. It was, by every measure I'd used for 20 years, the win. But wanting a thing and needing it turned out to be two very different columns on the same ledger, and Tom had spent our whole marriage teaching me how to read a balance sheet honestly. If I took that card, I would once again be a woman whose worth arrived from outside herself, granted by a powerful man, printed on stock I hadn't chosen, restored entirely on someone else's letterhead. I would be real again in exactly the way Deb had always measured real. I would win her specific game, and a person who wins someone else's game has still, in the end, agreed to play it. I looked at the card and heard Tom's voice again, clear as that last good week. Don't make the mistake of measuring yourself the same way. I understood, finally and completely, what he'd actually been trying to hand me. The 5 years by his bedside hadn't been a gap in my life. They had been the fullest, truest work I have ever done, and the world calling those years empty didn't make the world correct. It only meant I'd almost let the world's arithmetic override my own hands. I picked David's card up, held it a moment so he'd understand exactly what I was refusing, and set it back down, sliding it gently across the table toward him. Thank you, I said, meaning it completely. You have no idea what it means that you remembered. You saw me when my own family had already decided I was a cautionary tale, and I'll carry that. He waited, because good negotiators know when there's more coming. But I'm not going to take the seat, I said, and it isn't pride. You offered to restore me, to correct the record, put me back where you think I belong. But I never actually got lost out there, David. This room just forgot how to see clearly, and that was never mine to fix by accepting a better chair. I don't need restoring. I need to build my own table. One where the first question isn't what's your title, it's who did you take care of. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he laughed softly, picked his card back up, and told me that in 30 years, I was the first person he'd ever offered that seat to who chose instead to build a room of her own. He shook my hand, and told me he'd be my first client, if I'd have him. I told him I would. I went to find my son after that. Ethan was standing near the cake with Claire, looking like a boy whose beautiful day had cracked straight down the middle. I took both his hands and told him his wedding was still perfect, that none of what had happened was his to carry, and that his mother was more all right than she'd been in over a year, which was true. Claire hugged me, and over her shoulder, I looked across the tent to where Deb sat alone at the empty table, her navy cards nowhere in sight, staring at nothing in particular. I didn't go to her. There was no fixing it that night, and possibly not any night, and I'd already made a kind of peace with that. I caught her eye once across the tent, and I didn't gloat, and I didn't glare. I gave her one small, quiet nod. Not forgiveness exactly. Acknowledgement. Two sisters raised in the same house under the same rules about who gets to matter, and only one of us had just walked free of them. She looked away first. Later, once the dancing had started and no one needed me for anything, I stepped out into the vineyard dark, and stood there listening to the music leak out behind me. I took Tom's photograph out of my purse and looked at it under the string lights, the two of us laughing at something long forgotten outside the frame, and I told him quietly that I finally understood what he'd been trying to give me that last good week, and that I was sorry it had taken this long. For a year, I'd walked out of rooms feeling myself grow smaller in the doorway, feeling some invisible arithmetic subtract a little more of me each time. That night, I walked out of a room feeling exactly my own size for the first time since he died. I had no title, no card, and I'd just turned down a serious fortune and a real seat at the top of an industry I used to compete in, and I stood in the dark holding a photograph of a man I loved, and I was, for the first time in a long time, not between things. I was finally at the start of my own thing. That was a little over a year ago now, and I know you'll want to know what became of everyone since. I built the small consultancy I described to David that night, deliberately modest, 4 people and a careful, chosen list of clients, and David Whitfield was true to his word and became the first of them, which opened a few doors I didn't have to knock on twice. It isn't an empire, and I don't want one. I've already lived the version of my life that chased the biggest possible room, and I'm not interested in going back to it. This firm is enough. It's mine, and it measures the things I've decided actually matter. Deb left her firm that Monday, quietly, the way these things eventually surface in a small industry. The story followed her for a while, the way stories do, and she eventually landed at a smaller firm in another city, a rung lower, still climbing carefully. We are not close. I've stopped pretending we will be anytime soon. Some breaks don't heal into something stronger. They heal just enough to stop bleeding, and you learn to live with the scar and the distance both. The world's arithmetic hasn't changed either. It still worships the visible title, and quietly calls the caregiving years a gap on a resume. I can't fix that, and I've mostly stopped trying to. But Ethan and Claire come for dinner often now, and my son hugs me like a man who finally understands exactly what his mother is worth. Last month, I interviewed a woman for a position at my firm who'd spent 3 years out of the field caring for her own father. Her hands shook slightly when she reached the gap on her resume, visibly braced for the question everyone always asks about it. I didn't ask about the gap. I asked her to tell me about her father instead. She started to cry, and then she started to talk, and I knew I'd hire her before she'd even finished. That's my story. A held glass, a laugh I'd practiced, and a quiet man who set his drink down slowly enough that everyone at the table finally had to look at what was actually happening in front of them. If there's a quiet person in your own life holding more than the room around them can see, tell them today, before someone else gets to write the story for them first. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe, so the next story finds you when it's ready. And I'll see you in the next one.